June 6, 1944, 6:47 a.m. Omaha Beach, Normandy. The sound is not what the soldiers remember most, not the screaming of wounded men or the crack of German MG-42 machine guns slicing through the morning fog. It is the metallic grinding, the terrible, helpless scraping of steel treads against earth that refuses to yield. An M4 Sherman tank, 30 tons of American industrial might, sits motionless in the sand, its engine roaring in futility. The hedgerow before it stands silent, ancient, unmoved, thick as fortress walls. These earthen barriers, crowned with centuries-old roots, had turned the fields of Normandy into a medieval labyrinth. The tank commander, a young lieutenant from Iowa, hammers his fist against the turret hatch. Behind him, 3 more Shermans sit idle, their crews exposed, their mission stalled. Above, the smell of cordite mixes with wild roses still blooming along the hedgerow's crown, a strange, terrible beauty that makes the moment feel suspended between two worlds. The liberation of France was supposed to move like clockwork. After the bloody chaos of the beach landings, Allied planners had envisioned armored columns sweeping through the French countryside, crushing German resistance through speed and overwhelming firepower. The Sherman tank, reliable, mass-produced, the mechanical embodiment of American industrial supremacy, would lead the charge. 500 Shermans had rolled off the landing craft in the first 48 hours alone. Their crews were trained, their fuel tanks full, their orders clear, but no one had told them about the hedgerows. The bocage, as the French called it, had defined Norman agriculture since the Roman occupation. Farmers had piled earth and stone into borders between their fields, and over centuries, dense thickets of hawthorn, oak, and bramble had grown atop these mounds, their roots interweaving into barriers, sometimes 12 feet high and 4 feet thick at the base. There were thousands of them, creating a patchwork of tiny fields where visibility ended at 50 yards, and every intersection became a potential killing ground. American intelligence had noted them in reconnaissance reports, but had fatally underestimated their tactical significance. The hedgerows, it turned out, were perfect defensive terrain. German commanders grasped this immediately. Battle-hardened veterans from the Eastern Front recognized the bocage for what it was, nature's gift to the defender. They positioned machine gun nests at field corners, sighted anti-tank guns in shadowed lanes, and waited. When American Shermans approached a hedgerow, they had 2 choices, both terrible. They could attempt to bull through, forcing the tank's nose upward as it climbed the earthen mound, exposing the thin belly armor to German gunners. Or they could detour around, funneling into narrow lanes where a single well-placed Panzerfaust could disable the lead vehicle and trap the entire column. In the first week after D-Day, the Allied advance that should have covered 30 miles managed barely 7. Tanks that had survived the Atlantic crossing and the hell of the beach were now burning in Norman pastures, knocked out not by superior German armor, but by medieval farming practices and tactical geometry. The American armored crews had expected a different kind of war. They had trained in the deserts of California and the plains of Texas, where visibility stretched to the horizon and maneuver meant everything. They had studied the Africa Corps and Patton's sweeping victories in Sicily. They imagined themselves as cavalry, fast, mobile, exploiting breakthroughs. Instead, they found themselves in a grinding, claustrophobic infantry fight where their advantages meant nothing. The Sherman, for all its virtues, had never been designed for this. Its 75 mm gun could defeat most German armor at range, but range didn't exist here. Its speed, 25 miles per hour on roads, was meaningless when every 100 yards required breaching another hedgerow. Its numbers, the famous American production superiority, couldn't be brought to bear when only 1 tank at a time could engage. Frustration mounted into crisis. By mid-June, entire American divisions were stalled. The First Army commander, General Omar Bradley, watched his timetables disintegrate. The breakout from Normandy, the liberation of Paris, the drive to the Rhine, all of it depended on mobility, and mobility had died in the hedgerows. Staff officers proposed solutions, combat engineers with explosives to blast gaps, bulldozers to carve new roads, infantry advances to clear each field before tanks moved up. All of these worked, after a fashion, but all were murderously slow. Men died for yards. The wounded accumulated faster than field hospitals could process them, and still the hedgerows stood, ancient and indifferent, while the Germans poured reinforcements into Normandy and the window for strategic surprise closed day by day. It was in this moment of institutional paralysis that a single American sergeant, working in a tank depot behind the lines, began welding scrap metal to the front of Sherman tanks. His name was Curtis G. Culin Jr., though history would remember him simply as Sergeant Culin of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. He was 29 years old, a cab driver from New York before the war, with no engineering degree and no formal training in metallurgy or mechanical design. What he possessed was the practical, improvisational mindset of a man who had fixed things for a living, a mindset that would prove more valuable than all the technical expertise in the European theatre of operations. Culin had seen the problem firsthand during his unit's combat operations. He understood intuitively what the staff officers in their headquarters could not fully grasp. The hedgerow problem was not primarily tactical or strategic. It was mechanical. The Sherman could not physically breach the barriers without exposing itself to destruction. Therefore, the Sherman needed to be modified. The solution, Culin realized, required neither exotic materials nor precision engineering. It required only steel, a welding torch, and a willingness to void the tank's warranty. In the third week of June, working in a maintenance area near Colombier, Culin began experimenting with salvaged German beach obstacles, the steel hedgehogs that had been placed along the Atlantic Wall to impale landing craft. These were massive angular structures of forged steel, designed to withstand the impact of vessels displacing thousands of tons. They were, in other words, nearly indestructible, and the Normandy beaches were littered with them. Culin had several cut into sections and brought to his workshop. Then, using a standard army arc welder, he attached them to the front hull of a Sherman in a configuration that resembled enormous forked tusks, or perhaps the prongs of a medieval plough. The concept was brutally simple. The steel prongs would strike the base of a hedgerow before the tank's nose began to climb, cutting through the root mass like blades. The tank's weight and momentum would do the rest, forcing the prongs forward and downward, ripping a gap wide enough for the tank to pass through, without exposing its belly armor. The hedgerow would not be climbed, it would be gutted. On June 23, 1944, Culin's modified Sherman conducted its first field test. The location was a small pasture near Aral, empty, except for a single hedgerow, and a handful of engineers and tank crews who had heard rumors of the experiment. No officers were present. No official observers recorded the event. Culin himself drove the tank, approaching the hedgerow at moderate speed, perhaps 10 miles per hour. Witnesses later described the moment of impact, a sound like tearing canvas, amplified to the scale of thunder, as the steel prongs bit into centuries of compacted earth and root. The hedgerow shuddered. Dirt erupted into the air. The tank did not slow, its nose remained level, and then it was through, emerging on the far side of the barrier, in a shower of soil and splintered wood, its engine still running, its crew unharmed, the passage accomplished in less than 30 seconds. Word spread through the First Army with the speed of desperation. Here at last was something that worked. Not a theory, not a tactical doctrine, but a physical object that solved the physical problem. Tank crews and combat engineers descended on Culin's workshop, demanding details, requesting modifications for their own vehicles. Within 48 hours, the device had been demonstrated to officers at the divisional level. Within a week, it reached General Bradley himself. Bradley, who had been under immense pressure from Eisenhower and Marshall to accelerate the Normandy breakout, recognized immediately what he was seeing. This was not merely a clever field modification. It was a force multiplier that could restore the mobility of his entire armored force. He ordered the device into immediate mass production. There was only one problem. The army did not have a name for it, and Sergeant Culin had not bothered to invent one. It was Bradley's aide, or perhaps a staff officer present at the demonstration, accounts differ, who dubbed it the Rhinoceros after the animal's horn. The name stuck, though tankers themselves preferred the more direct hedgerow cutter or simply Culin's blades. The question of production was more complex. There were by late June over 2,000 Sherman tanks in Normandy, with more arriving daily. Each required a set of cutting prongs. The prongs needed to be made from hardened steel, capable of withstanding repeated impacts with earth, stone, and wood. And they needed to be installed quickly, by men working under field conditions, often within range of German artillery. The elegant solution came from the beaches themselves. The German beach obstacles, thousands of tons of forged steel, that the Wehrmacht had labored for months to install, became the raw material for the weapon that would break through their defensive line. Combat engineers with cutting torches harvested the obstacles, reducing them to manageable sections. Ordnance units established welding stations just behind the front lines, where tanks could be modified in less than a day. By the first week of July, hundreds of Shermans sported the distinctive prongs. By the third week, the majority of American armor in Normandy had been retrofitted. The transformation of American offensive capability was immediate and profound. Tank units that had been stalled for weeks began moving again. Commanders who had hoarded armor for fear of losses now committed entire battalions to breakthrough operations. The bocage, which had been the Germans' greatest natural ally, became merely terrain. Hedgerows still slowed the advance, but they no longer stopped it. A modified Sherman could breach 6 or 8 barriers in an hour, allowing armored columns to probe for weaknesses, exploit gaps, and maneuver in ways that had been impossible just weeks before. The Germans, for their part, watched this development with something approaching disbelief. Wehrmacht after-action reports from late July describe American tanks, equipped with cutting devices that allowed them to penetrate hedgerow barriers without exposing vulnerable hull surfaces. Some German officers initially assumed these were specialized engineer vehicles, produced in limited numbers. The realization that the Americans had modified their entire tank force in a matter of weeks in the field, under combat conditions, was both impressive and deeply troubling. It suggested an adaptability, a capacity for rapid innovation, that contradicted German assumptions about American military rigidity. For the panzergrenadiers and anti-tank crews dug in among the hedgerows, the psychological impact was perhaps even greater than the tactical one. They had been told that the bocage would neutralize American armor superiority, that the Sherman crews would be forced to fight at a disadvantage. This had proven true, for a time, and German morale had remained surprisingly high despite being outnumbered and outgunned. But now the rules had changed. The Americans had solved the puzzle. The natural fortress of the Norman countryside had been breached not by overwhelming force, but by a simple, elegant piece of engineering. It was, in microcosm, the kind of problem-solving that characterized the American war effort: practical, improvisational, and scalable. Private Heinrich Böll, a Wehrmacht infantryman who would later become one of post-war Germany's most celebrated authors, wrote in his diary during this period about the sound of American tanks breaching hedgerows near his position. Like the earth itself tearing open, we thought we were safe behind the old walls. We were wrong. German units began falling back from hedgerow positions that had been considered impregnable, recognizing that they could no longer rely on terrain to offset American material advantages. The slow bleeding attrition of early July gave way to something faster and more desperate. On July 25, 1944, the Americans launched Operation Cobra, the long-delayed breakout offensive. Preceded by the largest tactical bombing in history, over 1,500 heavy bombers dropping nearly 4,000 tons of explosives on a 5-mile stretch of German line, Cobra succeeded in part because American armor could now exploit the gaps that bombing created. Modified Shermans poured through breaches in the German defensive network, bypassing strong points, cutting supply lines, and turning static trench warfare back into a war of movement. Within a week, American forces had advanced 50 miles. Within a month, they had liberated Paris. It would be an exaggeration to credit the Rhinoceros device with winning the Battle of Normandy. The Allies possessed overwhelming advantages in men, material, and air power. German forces were already stretched thin, facing not only the Western Allies but also the vast Soviet offensives in the East. But wars are not won by advantages in the abstract. They are won by solving specific, immediate problems. The problem of the beach, the problem of the hedgerow, the problem of the river crossing. Culin's invention solved a problem that had paralyzed an army. It returned mobility to armored warfare at the exact moment when mobility was most needed. In doing so, it shortened the campaign, saved lives, and demonstrated a capacity for innovation that the German military, for all its tactical brilliance, could not match. The official U.S. Army history of the Normandy campaign, written in the 1950s, devotes less than 2 pages to the Rhinoceros device. Sergeant Culin received the Legion of Merit for his invention, an honor he accepted with characteristic modesty, insisting that others had contributed to the design. This was true in a sense. Tank crews had suggested modifications, welders had refined the attachment points, and officers had facilitated production. But the core insight that the hedgerow problem could be solved by cutting rather than climbing belonged to Culin alone. It was the kind of insight that emerges not from formal education, but from a life spent making things work with whatever materials are at hand. After the war, Culin returned to New York and resumed his career as a cab driver. He gave few interviews and seemed uncomfortable with attention. When asked about his invention, he typically deflected, saying that he had simply done what any mechanic would have done in the same situation. This humility, so characteristic of his generation, obscures the magnitude of what he accomplished. In the span of a few weeks, working with scrap metal and borrowed tools, he had solved a problem that had stumped division commanders and staff planners. He had done so not by following procedure or waiting for authorization, but by recognizing that the situation demanded action and that he possessed the skills to act. There is a photograph of Culin, taken sometime in August 1944, standing beside a Sherman tank equipped with his cutting device. He is smiling slightly, almost shyly, one hand resting on the steel prong. Behind him, the Norman countryside stretches away, peaceful in late summer light. The hedgerows are still there, of course. They would remain there long after the war, continuing to mark the boundaries of French farms growing wild roses in June. But they are no longer barriers, they are simply hedgerows. The story of Curtis Culin and the Rhinoceros device is, at one level, a story about engineering and innovation. But it is also a story about the deeper character of the American war effort, its strengths, its improvisations, and the peculiar genius of its citizen soldiers. The Wehrmacht was by most measures the most professional military force of the Second World War. Its officers were superbly trained, its doctrine was sophisticated, and its soldiers were imbued with a culture of obedience and tactical excellence. But professionalism can become rigidity, and excellence can breed contempt for the unconventional. The German military machine was designed to execute brilliant plans flawlessly. It was less well designed to adapt when those plans failed. The American military, by contrast, was an amateur force in the best sense of that word. Its officers were often recent civilians with limited military experience. Its soldiers were drafted from every conceivable background: farmers and factory workers, clerks and college students, cab drivers and coal miners. They brought with them not military tradition, but the habits of a democratic industrial society, a willingness to question authority, a comfort with improvisation, and a faith that problems could be solved through ingenuity and hard work. These qualities were not always advantages. American units in their first engagements were often outfought by more experienced German troops. American planning could be chaotic, American logistics wasteful, American tactics unimaginative, but when faced with an unexpected problem, the American military possessed a capacity for rapid, decentralized innovation that its enemies could not replicate. Culin's device is emblematic of this capacity. He was not an engineer or a designer. He held no advanced degree and had no connection to the military-industrial complex. He was simply a competent man with a practical mind who saw a problem and set about fixing it. The army, to its credit, recognized the value of what he had created and scaled it into mass production with remarkable speed. This combination, individual initiative supported by institutional flexibility, was repeated thousands of times across the war, in every theater, at every level. It was GIs rigging extra armor onto trucks, pilots developing new tactics in combat, medics improvising treatments with whatever supplies they had. It was in aggregate a force multiplier more powerful than any single weapon. The Germans, watching this unfold from the other side of the hedgerows, struggled to comprehend it. Their intelligence reports from Normandy are filled with observations about American technical resourcefulness and field modifications, always described with a mixture of respect and frustration. How could an army that seemed so doctrinally unsophisticated adapt so quickly? How could soldiers with so little training solve problems that professional officers had deemed unsolvable? The answer, though the Germans could not articulate it, lay in the nature of the societies that had produced these armies. Germany had built a military machine, America had mobilized a society, and societies, for all their apparent chaos, possess a resilience and creativity that machines do not. There is an object that recurs throughout the story of Normandy, an object so mundane that its symbolic weight is easy to miss: the welding torch. Not a weapon, not even a particularly advanced piece of technology, but a simple tool for joining metal to metal. In Culin's hands it became the instrument of transformation. The welding torch took scrap, the debris of war, the shattered remnants of German defenses, and repurposed it into something new and functional. It joined the old to the new, the European obstacle to the American tank, creating a hybrid more effective than either component alone. This perhaps is the deeper metaphor. America's strength in the Second World War was not primarily its factories or its resources, though these were vast. It was its ability to adapt, to combine, to weld together disparate elements into functional solutions. The American army was itself such a combination: farm boys and city kids, immigrants and native-born thrown together and forged into a fighting force. The arsenal of democracy was not just tanks and planes, but ideas. The idea that a cab driver might have insight that a general lacked, the idea that problems could be solved through experimentation rather than doctrine, the idea that authority should serve effectiveness rather than the reverse. When Culin welded German steel onto American armor, he was performing an act of creative destruction that perfectly captured the American approach to war. Take what the enemy built, tear it apart, use the pieces to defeat him. There is a ruthless practicality to this, but also a kind of optimism, a belief that no problem is permanent, that every barrier can be breached, that failure is merely an invitation to try something else. This optimism, so often mistaken for naivete, was in fact a profound strategic advantage. It meant that setbacks did not become defeats. It meant that armies could learn, evolve, and improve, even in the midst of combat. It meant that a stalemate in the hedgerows, which might have paralyzed a less flexible force, became instead an opportunity for innovation. By the autumn of 1944, the hedgerows of Normandy were far behind the advancing Allied armies. The war had moved eastward across the Seine, through Belgium, toward the German frontier. The modified Shermans continued in service, their cutting prongs still useful for breaching obstacles, though none as formidable as the Bottige. Some were lost to mines or Panzerfausts, others threw a track or burned an engine and were abandoned. A few survived the war and were photographed in Germany in May 1945, still bearing the distinctive tusks that had carried them across France. In the decades since, the Rhinoceros device has become a minor footnote in military history, overshadowed by more dramatic innovations and larger battles. The beaches of Normandy draw millions of visitors each year, but few pause to consider the hedgerows or the unglamorous engineering that allowed the invasion to succeed. This obscurity is, in a way, appropriate. Culin sought no fame. The device worked, the war was won, and that was sufficient. But for those who study the mechanics of victory, the small, practical decisions that accumulate into strategic success, the story of the hedgerow cutter remains instructive. It reminds us that wars are not won solely by grand strategy or technological superiority. They are won by soldiers, often very young soldiers, confronting immediate, unglamorous problems. A barrier that will not yield, a machine that will not function, a plan that does not survive contact with reality. And they are won by the officers and institutions that empower those soldiers to solve problems, rather than simply report them up the chain of command. Culin could have noted the hedgerow issue in a report and waited for guidance from higher headquarters. Instead, he found a cutting torch and went to work. His commanders could have dismissed his invention as unauthorized or risky. Instead, they recognized its value and put it into production. This combination of individual initiative and institutional support was in many ways the secret weapon of the Allied war effort. There is a cemetery in Normandy, one of many, where American soldiers are buried beneath rows of white crosses that stretch to the horizon. The hedgerows there have been trimmed back, maintained by groundskeepers, no longer the wild fortress-like barriers they once were. In summer, roses still bloom along their edges. Visitors walk the rows in silence, pausing occasionally to read a name, a date, an inscription. Most of the dead were very young, most were far from home, most died in the weeks between D-Day and the breakout, the slow, grinding battle for the bocage. It is impossible to know how many of them died because tanks could not breach the hedgerows. Impossible to quantify how many lives Culin's device saved by restoring mobility to the American advance. War does not offer controlled experiments. We cannot rerun history without the Rhinoceros and count the difference. But we know that the campaign was stalled, that men were dying for yards, and that the modification allowed the offensive to resume. We know that the breakout, when it came, was swift and decisive, that German forces were routed, that the liberation of France was completed months ahead of the worst-case projections. And we know that these outcomes were not inevitable. They required decisions, innovations, risks. They required someone, somewhere, to pick up a welding torch and try something new. Curtis Culin died in 1963, at the age of 48, of a heart attack in Queens, New York. His obituary in the local paper was brief and made no mention of the war. A few veterans groups and military historians noted his passing. The army sent a letter of condolence to his family, and that was all. The man who had given armored warfare back to the American army in its moment of greatest need passed into obscurity, leaving behind a widow, 2 children, and a legacy that few outside military circles remembered. But the device endures, not in museums. For most of the modified tanks were scrapped after the war, their steel recycled into the reconstruction of Europe, not in memorials, for there are no statues of Culin, no plaques commemorating his invention. The device endures instead in the historical record, in after-action reports and unit histories, in the memoirs of tankers who used it, and the memories of Germans who faced it. It endures as an example, a case study taught in staff colleges and engineering schools, of how ingenuity can trump doctrine, how a citizen soldier can solve a problem that baffled professionals, how a single good idea, properly implemented, can change the course of a campaign. In the end, the story of the Rhinoceros device is a story about freedom, not in the abstract, rhetorical sense, but in the practical, mechanical sense. Freedom to question, to experiment, to improvise. Freedom to say, this is not working, and to try something different. Freedom to value results over procedure, effectiveness over tradition. These freedoms were not luxuries or indulgences. In Normandy, in the summer of 1944, they were matters of life and death. An army that could not adapt, that could not empower its soldiers to solve problems, would have remained pinned in the bocage while German reinforcements arrived, and the window for victory closed. An army that could adapt, that could take a cab driver's idea and turn it into a weapon that changed the nature of the battlefield, could break through, could advance, could win. The Germans, fighting for a regime that valued obedience above all, that punished initiative and demanded conformity, could not have produced a Sergeant Culin. Their soldiers were brave, and their officers were skilled, but they fought within a system that stifled the kind of creative problem-solving that the hedgerows demanded. When faced with unexpected challenges, they fell back on doctrine, on established practice, on waiting for orders from above. This approach had worked, for a time, when the Wehrmacht was on the offensive, executing carefully planned invasions. But in Normandy, on the defensive, faced with an enemy that could innovate faster than doctrine could adapt, it was insufficient. The welding torch, then, becomes a symbol of democratic warfare. Not the grand symbols, the flag, the anthem, the speeches about liberty and justice, but the small, practical tools that ordinary people use to build and fix and improve. In a democracy, authority flows upward from the citizen. In a democratic army, solutions can flow upward from the soldier. This is messy and inefficient, and sometimes produces terrible ideas, but it also produces Rhinoceros, it produces innovation at the speed of necessity, it produces victory. June 6, 1944 was the beginning. The beaches were the prologue, but the real test of the Allied armies came not in the landings but in the weeks that followed, in the hedgerows where the German defense should have held, where the advance should have stalled, where the outcome was uncertain. It was there, in those tangled lanes and overgrown fields, that the war could have been lost. It was there that a sergeant with a welding torch made certain that it would not be. The roses bloom again in Normandy each June, climbing the hedgerows that have stood for centuries and will stand for centuries more. Tourists photograph them, unaware of what these barriers once meant, of the lives they claimed and the battles they witnessed. But the hedgerows remember, in their own silent way. They remember the sound of steel tearing through earth, the smell of diesel and cordite, the weight of history bearing down on them. And they remember yielding at last to a force they could not withstand, not the force of bombs or bullets, but the force of human ingenuity, improvisation, and the stubborn refusal to accept that some problems cannot be solved. In the end, that may be the truest lesson of Curtis Culin and his Rhinoceros device, that barriers exist to be breached, that problems exist to be solved, that the difference between victory and defeat sometimes comes down not to who has the bigger army or the better plan, but to who is willing to pick up a torch and start welding. In the summer of 1944, in the fields of Normandy, that made all the difference.